In the final year of the Great War, a new force arrived on the battlefields of France. The American Expeditionary Forces, under General John J. Pershing, breathed new life into the weary Allies. After years of brutal stalemate, the tide was about to turn. U.S. troops brought more than just manpower, they brought hope. For nearly 3 years, trench warfare had ravaged both sides. But the arrival of the American First Army marked a decisive shift, reigniting the Allies' drive to push forward. At first, the U.S. stood apart from the global conflict. But by 1917, German submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram forced the nation's hand. In April, President Wilson declared war on Germany, and by the summer of 1918, over 1 million American troops were in France, ready to fight. Yet, victory wouldn't come easily. The American soldiers had to integrate with their Allied counterparts, adapting to the brutal realities of modern warfare. They were eager but untested in the horrors of the front lines. The formation of the American First Army under General Pershing marked a new phase. No longer just reinforcements for British and French troops, the Americans now operated as an independent force. This shift would soon prove crucial. Their first test came at St. Mihiel in September 1918. In a swift and decisive victory, American forces captured over 13,000 German soldiers. It was a bold statement. The Americans were ready to make their mark. Next, they faced the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest and deadliest operation for U.S. forces in the war. Over 1.2 million American soldiers fought through brutal conditions, determined to break the German defenses. As the Americans advanced, the German army began to crumble. Facing low morale and dwindling supplies, Germany's defenses collapsed. The Meuse-Argonne offensive delivered a critical blow, driving German forces out of France. Together, the combined strength of the Allies, now reinforced by American troops, forced Germany into retreat. With the war clearly lost, Germany sought an armistice. On November 11, 1918, the bloodiest conflict in history came to an end. With the armistice came relief, but also a time to reflect. Over 100,000 American soldiers had given their lives to help bring an end to the war. Their contribution to the Allied victory was undeniable. The United States emerged from World War I as a rising global power. The lessons learned from the war shaped American military strategy and foreign policy for decades. The bravery of U.S. troops, particularly during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, left an indelible mark on history. The Great War was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but its consequences reverberated throughout the 20th century. Still, the courage of U.S. soldiers in 1918 remains a testament to their role in securing the Allied victory and shaping the course of global history. The war may have ended with an armistice, but the memory of those who fought endures. Their courage, their sacrifice, these will never be forgotten.
All right, so, ever wonder how the U.S. ended up really helping to end World War I?
Yeah.
Like, was it just like sending a bunch of troops, or was there more to it? Because, like, picture it's 1918. Europe is just like stuck in this awful back and forth, trench warfare.
Yeah.
And it's not looking good for anybody. The outcome is totally uncertain.
Yeah.
So your mission, should you choose to accept it for this deep dive, is to figure out how the American Expeditionary Forces, from when they first get there to that armistice, how they actually changed the course of the war.
It's kind of wild to think that for a big chunk of the war, the U.S., they were just like watching from the sidelines.
Right.
You've got this huge conflict, like a world war, and one of the, future superpowers is just neutral.
Yeah.
Can you imagine like the conversations that were happening back then?
Oh, I can only imagine. So it's 1918. Europe is stuck in this like horrible stalemate trench warfare, but the U.S. is neutral, at least at first, right?
Yeah, that's right. But then there were these two big things that basically forced the U.S. into the war.
Okay.
First, you've got German submarines, these U-boats, sinking ships without warning.
Oh, wow.
It didn't matter who the ships belonged to. This was like a direct threat to American trade and security.
Yeah, so like staying neutral is getting harder.
Exactly, especially when your own ships are at risk. And then you get the Zimmermann telegram.
Okay.
Talk about like drama unfolding. Germany tries to secretly get Mexico to attack the U.S.
What?
They even promised to give Mexico back land they had lost.
No way.
Yeah, huge diplomatic blunder.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, this telegram, it gets intercepted.
Right,
It's made public, and, well, America is outraged.
Wow, I never knew that about the Zimmermann telegram. Like, what was the public reaction at the time?
Oh, it was huge. Newspapers had these, like, fiery headlines. People were protesting in the streets.
Yeah.
There was this real feeling of, like, betrayal and anger.
Yeah, I bet.
And this, on top of the submarine attacks, it just put so much pressure on President Wilson to do something.
Right. So, all this public pressure, these security threats, and this like crazy plan, and bam, the U.S. declares war in April 1917.
Yeah.
What a turning point.
A turning point for sure. And the impact was almost immediate.
Wow.
By the summer of 1918, over 1 million American troops, we call them the American Expeditionary Forces, they were, in France, ready to fight.
Oh, wow.
For the Allies, who were, pretty worn out by then, this was huge. Fresh soldiers and a huge morale boost.
So they weren't just there to like, fill in the gaps.
No, not at all. The U.S. wanted to make a real impact, a difference.
Right.
And that's where the American First Army comes in.
Okay.
It wasn't just about like reinforcing the existing lines. This was about establishing an independent American force under General John J. Pershing. It was like a statement, we're here and we're a force to be reckoned with.
Right. That's a big shift. It's like not just helping out, but like leading the charge.
Exactly. It showed the world that the U.S. was a major military power.
Yeah.
One that was ready to take a bigger role on the world stage. You could say it was like a coming-of-age moment for American military might.
I like that. And what was like their first big test as this independent force?
The Battle of Samael, September 1918.
Oh, yeah, Samael. I was, reading up on this a little bit. It was a pretty quick win for the Americans, right?
I was.
Like they captured over 13,000 German soldiers.
Yeah, they did.
Bro.
And the speed, the decisiveness, it was a big deal.
Yeah.
Not only did they achieve their goals, strategically, but the win at Samael, it was this huge confidence boost.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
For both the American troops and the Allies. This victory, it really set the stage for something much bigger, much more significant.
Okay, and what was that?
The Meuse-Argonne Offensive.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
This was a massive battle, right?
It was huge.
Like, what made it so important?
Well, for one, it was the largest and deadliest operation for U.S. forces in the whole war.
Wow.
Over 1.2 million American soldiers were involved.
Wow.
Fighting in some of the toughest conditions imaginable.
Yeah, so this is where we really have to talk about what, like, trench warfare actually meant.
Right.
Because we keep saying it, but what was it actually like for these soldiers?
Imagine like miles and miles of these muddy, rat-infested trenches, often filled with standing water.
Yeah.
Disease was everywhere. The constant shelling was deafening, and the psychological toll, it was immense.
Yeah.
Just the thought of going like over the top into no man's land, facing machine guns and barbed wire.
Oh, yeah.
It was a horrifying reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine the courage it took to face those conditions every day.
Right.
And over 1 million Americans fighting in that.
It was a brutal battle of attrition.
Yeah.
Just relentless. But the Americans, they fought with incredible determination. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, it was a real turning point in the war.
How so? Like, what made it a turning point?
The Americans, they were advancing.
Right.
And combined with the pressure from all the other Allied forces, it just put so much strain on the German army.
Oh, yeah?
Their morale was plummeting, their supplies were dwindling, and their lines were starting to crumble. Remember how we talked about those early days when the U.S. was neutral?
Yeah.
Well, now they were delivering a decisive blow to the German war effort.
That's quite a change in just over a year.
It really is, and it shows the impact of the American Expeditionary Forces. They brought in fresh troops and this renewed fighting spirit to a war that had been dragging on for years. In the end, they played a major role in pushing Germany towards collapse.
It's wild to see how the U.S. went from, like, observer to major player so quickly.
Yeah, it is.
But of course, the story doesn't end there.
Right.
We still have to talk about the armistice, the aftermath, and like the long-lasting impact of the war.
And that's what we'll get into when we come back.
So before we went to break, we were talking about like how the American Expeditionary Forces were really like pushing back the German army. It's crazy how they like totally changed the momentum of the whole war.
Yeah, it was a big turning point. Germany was facing this like unstoppable force. Their morale was shot. They were running out of resources, and the Allies were like closing in on them.
Yeah.
They couldn't keep fighting forever.
So this is like where things start moving towards an armistice.
Yeah, exactly. The German leaders, they knew how bad things were.
Right.
And they started looking for a way to end the fighting.
I bet like the whole world was just like holding its breath, hoping for the bloodshed to end.
Oh, for sure.
After 4 years of this awful war, everyone must have been desperate for peace.
Absolutely. 4 years of just unbelievable destruction.
Yeah.
So many lives lost. Entire countries were scarred. Economies were ruined. Millions of people were dead. The world needed a break.
And then finally, on November 11th, 1918.
The armistice was signed. It was like this huge wave of relief.
Yeah.
A collective sigh of relief across the world.
I can imagine like celebrations in the streets.
Oh, yeah.
People crying, tears of joy.
Definitely. Imagine all that emotion.
Yeah.
The hope that like a new era of peace was beginning. But, you know, even with all the celebrating, there was this harsh reality, too.
Right.
The war had this huge human cost.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that even in victory, there's a price to pay.
Exactly.
Over 100,000 American soldiers died in the fighting. So many families back home were devastated.
It's tragic. The armistice stopped the fighting, but the healing process, well, that was just starting.
Yeah.
The world, especially the U.S., had this huge task ahead of them, rebuilding and figuring out their place in a post-war world.
That makes me think, like, how did the U.S., you know, a country that didn't even want to be the war at first, how did they handle this new global landscape?
It's interesting, right? Before the war, the U.S. was mainly focused on stuff happening at home. But World War I, it like threw them onto the world stage. Suddenly they were a major power.
So they went from being kind of isolated to like a global powerhouse.
Exactly. What were some of the biggest changes they faced right away?
Well, the war showed everyone how powerful their industries were.
Yeah.
And how they could like mobilize resources on this huge scale. So they had this newfound economic strength. They had proven their military was strong.
Right.
They couldn't just ignore world affairs anymore.
Yeah. And their foreign policy had to change too.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
The whole experience of World War I, it shaped American foreign policy for decades.
How so?
Well, they started focusing more on international engagement.
Okay.
And they believed they needed to actively prevent future wars.
Right.
They started to see themselves as like a global leader.
But the war didn't just change things politically for the U.S.
Right. No, not at all. The war effort involved the whole country.
Yeah.
Women started doing jobs that men usually did, and there was this huge surge in patriotism.
So like World War I had these ripple effects throughout American society.
Exactly. It changed their culture, their social fabric.
And we can still see those effects today.
For sure. It's amazing how something that happened a century ago still has an impact on us now.
It's kind of sobering to think that the war, they call it the war to end all wars, actually led to even more conflict and devastation.
It is.
Which brings us to this like really complicated question.
Yeah.
If World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, why didn't it work?
It's a big question.
Yeah.
It takes a deep understanding of history, ideology, and like human nature to even begin to answer it. What do you think? What are some of the things that contributed to this, like tragic failure?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is the Treaty of Versailles.
The treaty.
The agreement that officially ended the war.
Yeah.
How did that play a role?
Well, the treaty was really harsh on Germany.
Oh, yeah.
They lost a lot of territory, had to pay huge reparations, and their military was restricted. All of that created this like resentment and instability in Germany.
Right.
And it basically set the stage for more conflict down the road.
So the treaty, which was supposed to bring peace, actually contributed to the rise of extremism and eventually World War II.
That's one way to look at it. Some people argue that the treaty was necessary to hold Germany accountable and prevent them from being aggressive again.
Right.
But others think that being more lenient might have stopped the rise of fascism and prevented another world war.
So there's like no easy answer.
Nope.
It's a debate that historians are still having today.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating but tragic part of history.
It reminds us that the consequences of war go way beyond the battlefield, and that building peace is this really delicate, ongoing process.
That's a good point. And I think this is a good place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot, from the armistice to the lasting effects of World War I.
We have.
But there's still more to explore.
Right.
When we come back, we'll dig into those unanswered questions. And we'll look at how the lessons of the Great War still shape the world we live in today. All right, so welcome back to our deep dive into the American Expeditionary Forces in World War I. We've been on like a fascinating journey tracing their impact from setting foot in Europe to that armistice and all the, complicated stuff that came after.
Yeah, it's incredible how much their involvement, really changed the direction of the war and the whole world, really, setting things up for like the whole 20th century.
Right, totally. And, we've gone over a lot of details, but now I'm thinking, like, what are the big takeaways for, the listener? What's the lasting importance of the U.S. being in this huge conflict?
Well, I think one thing that's like undeniable is just how resilient and determined those American troops were.
Yeah.
They crossed an ocean, to fight in this brutal war, and they faced those awful conditions in the trenches. In the end, they really helped the Allies win.
And their contributions were more than just like numbers, right?
Exactly. The American Expeditionary Forces brought this like new wave of energy, a new fighting spirit to a war that had been going on for years. Their victories, especially in Meuse-Argonne, those were really important in breaking that stalemate and forcing Germany to, collapse.
Yeah, that Meuse-Argonne offensive, that was such a key moment.
Totally.
The biggest and deadliest battle in American history up to that point. It really showed how strong the U.S. military was becoming.
Yeah, it did. It was brutal, a really costly battle.
Yeah.
But it solidified their place, as this major military power. And it showed the world they were a force to be reckoned with. The war, you could say, marked the beginning of like the American century.
Wow.
The U.S. took on this bigger role in everything that was happening globally.
It's hard to imagine the 20th century, even the world we live in now, without thinking about how World War I changed everything and the part the U.S. played in, like deciding how it all ended.
It's definitely something to think about. It's kind of sad that the war to end all wars actually led to, more conflicts and more awful stuff.
Yeah.
But I think even with all that tragedy, there are like these important lessons to learn, stories of bravery, of sacrifice that should be remembered.
Absolutely. And that's where it gets really personal, I think, for the people listening.
Yeah.
How do we, like as individuals, deal with, this legacy? What can we learn from the people who fought and died in this war?
I think that's a question we should all be asking. For me, it's about, remembering.
Right.
Honoring the sacrifices and trying to really understand what causes these conflicts so we can, maybe work towards a more peaceful future.
I agree. And it's also about recognizing that war has this huge human cost.
Yeah.
Beyond the statistics, beyond the battle lines on a map,
right,
there were millions of individual stories, lives lost, families changed forever, dreams that were, just shattered.
Every single one. It reminds us how fragile peace really is and how important it is to talk to each other, to understand each other, to have empathy in our relationships with other countries. That's the message we need to take with us.
That's a great way to put it. And I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the American Expeditionary Forces and what they did in World War I.
It's been really interesting, but like always, the conversation keeps going.
Right.
We want you to keep learning about this really important time in history.
Yeah.
Dig deeper into those stories, the battles, and all the lasting effects of the Great War. There are tons of books, documentaries, and, stuff online to help you learn.
Yeah, you might even have a personal connection to all of this, like a grandparent or great-grandparent who was in the war. Their stories are out there waiting to be discovered.
And as you keep learning, think about that question we talked about earlier. Why, even after all the horrible things that happened in World War I, couldn't the world prevent more conflicts?
It makes you think about, what makes people do the things they do, and what makes countries go to war.
Yeah.
It's a question that, even 100 years later, is still so relevant.
So keep learning, keep asking those tough questions, and keep the memory of those who served alive. Their stories have so much to teach us about, the past, the present, and the future we're creating together.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
Until next time.